I'd like to start this video off by saying that I hope everyone was safe during the hurricane. Thankfully things weren't near as bad as they could have been, but still there was a lot of work to be done, so if you're wondering why I haven't posted in a while, that'd be it. Alright, let's quit yapping and start the video. We're about to change our text display up. Unity's default text system is kind of lacking in visual clarity. As long as the text is large, there's no issue, but if we zoom in or use a smaller font size, everything's blurry. Now, if that doesn't bother you, great, but we're going to change it up for more than clarity. Now, in the newer versions of Unity, there's an asset pack that comes standard, and that's called TextMeshPro. From Game Object in the header menu, under UI, select TextMeshPro and add an instance to your scene. If this is your first time using it, a window will pop up requiring you to import the essentials for TMPro to work. Make sure you click the top button. The bottom button isn't so important as it just gives you primarily examples of how the asset's used. And once it's imported, we can go ahead and close that window. And now we have a TextMeshPro instance in our UI. TextMeshPro is great for a number of reasons. First of all, and probably what it's most well known for, is the crispness of its characters. TextMeshPro isn't blurry in the slightest bit unless you want it to be. And we all know that if we set Unity's text font size to 1, the characters are going to be an amorphous mess. But with TextMeshPro it doesn't care, it's going to render everything out real nice. And it's also good in that it adds the capability for adding pictures into our text fields, but we'll focus on that later in the video. For now, let's replace the speaker name and text and speech field text components for TMPro's replacements. Just parent the instance to our speech text, so that way we can snap the bounds in place more easily. And while we're here, let me go ahead and show you something to look out for. Go ahead and delete the current speech text because we no longer need that. TextMeshPro by default automatically lets extra text overflow past its own bounds. For speech text, we don't want that. We want to constrain it, or truncate it. At least I do. So to take care of that, we want to enable truncation. And where it currently says overflow, set it to truncate, and now it cuts off the excess text. Now let's duplicate it and do the same thing for the speaker name. The only difference is with the speaker name, I want it to overflow if the name is too long. I don't want it to be cut off and potentially show no one as being the active speaker. So I'll set truncate to overflow and word wrap to false, and voila! That's the appearance I want. So just make sure the anchors are set in the correct positions now. Good, but now that we're no longer using default text, we need to update our dialog system so we can still retrieve those objects. Enter the Dialog System class and incorporate the TMPro namespace, which contains all our TextMeshPro resources. Then down at the bottom where I reference speech text and speaker text, I'll change their variables from the UI.text to TextMeshPro UGUI. And now let's add these references to the dialog system in the scene. And without any additional work, TextMeshPro immediately takes over for our previous text. It's as easy as that. But there is one thing we need to add. In the last video, we made adaptive text to keep our text proportional to the screen size without using best fit. But now we need to replicate it, that's specifically for TextMeshPro. Fortunately, it's as easy as duplicating the script, referencing TMPro, and swapping text for TextMeshPro UGUI. Then, just add the new code to both TMPro objects, and they adapt with the screen resolution as the previous text did. Okay, so now let's dive into how to use sprites inside the text system. Sprites can be used for any number of instances, like end-of-dialogue symbols, or illustrations of weapons or other things that are being talked about. In this instance, I'm going to show how happy I am, with a smiley face. The way we get a sprite in TextMeshPro is by using the tag symbols and the keyword sprite. I give it an index of 0, and now I've got a smiley face emoji in the text. These sprites are accessed through a special array, so I can increment this number and get different sprites. But these are just the default sprites, and I bet you're wondering where it gets these from anyway. Navigate to TextMeshPro directory in your Assets folder and search for the settings file like this. This file defines the default settings used by any TextMeshPro instance, and down lower in the inspector there's a spot called Default Sprite Assets with a link to a Sprite asset file. Notice it's the emoji file. This is how we're loading the smiley faces. The Sprite assets should always be located in this folder, so when we make our own, we need to store them here. Now inside the asset, expand the sprite list and we see all the sprites in the array. Click on a sprite to enable editing, and notice the ID field in the top left. That's our index. That's what makes 0 equal the blushing face and 1 equal the guy with his tongue sticking out. Also notice the name field. This is more user-friendly in a way, where we can call a specific name to load sprites instead of by indexes. So let's name this guy Tongue and call him by that instead of his index. When you use a name, you need to have the name in quotation marks, and where we say sprite, we need to say sprite name instead. And that's how we can load sprites by name. Okay, so now let's load our own sprites into text. Start by importing your image into Unity. Split it if there are multiple sprites in the image. Once that's done, we need to turn it into a sprite asset, so right-click it, go to Create, and choose TextMeshPro Sprite Asset. And that's going to make a usable reference for TM-Pro. So here's the asset, and as we open it in the inspector, you can see the icon in my array. I'm going to change the name to Stellar Studio Logo and call it that way. Okay, so I set the name, but you can see nothing's happening. And that's because we aren't officially using this sprite asset, so my logo isn't exactly known yet. If we want to use it, then I have two choices. Number one, I can change the default sprite asset used by coming into the TM-Pro folder, searching for the settings, and then changing the default sprite asset to the one that I just created. Just like this. There. And doing that now allows me to call the logo by index or name, because this is now the active asset. It's definitely simple, but not really practical if you've got multiple sprite assets you want to hop back and forth between. Okay, so luckily there is another way. Instead of doing that, we can take the new sprite asset and move it to the sprite assets directory, which by default is in TM-Pro Resources Sprite Assets. And now the asset is officially referenceable, but you see that my logo still isn't appearing in text. And that's because when we load a sprite from this directory, we also need to say what file to load it from. So in our text, this is now what we type. Say sprite equals, and in quotation marks give the exact name of the file. Then identify whether we load by index or name. And boom, now my logo is loaded into the text. Just be sure you type exactly in the format that I did. No spaces between sprite, the equal sign, and the file name. You can also use the name in the place of the index. Just be sure to use quotation marks as we did earlier to make this work. Now, sometimes your sprites may be aligned improperly. For my icon, it's too low, and it's also hiding my period at the end of the sentence. So we can open the Sprite Assets file and start playing with the values of the individual elements until we get the best look. Changing the X and Y offset now positions my icon in a much more appropriate location. But it's not quite good enough. I've still got some changes to make. Messing with the advanced value, we can change how far after the icon the next bit of text should start forming. And the final value is your scale. Just play around until you find the best fit for your sprites. It really doesn't take long. And to be honest, that looks pretty good as it is. But alright, hold up for a moment. We've introduced a problem, and that deals with our text architect, because it's looking for tags to open and close, and it finds the sprite and treats it like an encapsulator, terminating it with -sprite. That's because it doesn't know the difference between encapsulator and injection tags. Bold, italic, underline, and color are encapsulator tags, so they should start and terminate, but sprite is just an injection. It only has to be inserted to work. We'll make all that work in the next video. But first, here's another advantage to TextMeshPro over ordinary text in Unity, and this will also be covered in the next video. And that's the dirty little secret that you don't actually have to terminate tags in TextMeshPro. And if you do, they don't even have to be terminated in the order they were applied initially. Kinda makes our text architect seem inefficient now, doesn't it? Well, not really. If you use any form of default text display, form rather, then you definitely want our current text architect, as that's how it should work. But since we're going to be using TextMeshPro, we can take the opportunity to simplify the architect dramatically. And I mean very dramatically. We'll do that in the next video, and should take about 5 minutes. Until then, at least now you know how to use Sprites, and we'll make it all come together in the final text architect when we return. Until then, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and go ahead and subscribe if you're new. I'll see you guys in the next video, and it won't be long now until we start building an actual visual novel, so get ready.